December 19, 1944. Snow fell like ash over Bastogne as the 101st Airborne found itself completely surrounded. Nearly 10,000 American soldiers were trapped inside the frozen Belgian town, their ammunition dwindling, medical supplies exhausted, and wounded men shivering in dark cellars while German artillery pounded them day and night. Panzer divisions tightened the noose from all sides, their tanks grinding forward through forests and icy roads, confident that the weather, thick clouds, blizzards and freezing winds, had grounded Allied aircraft and cut off any hope of resupply. Inside the town, every bullet was counted, every bandage reused. Soldiers wrote hurried notes by candlelight, unsure if anyone would ever read them. Far away at Supreme Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over a sprawling map of Europe, his face tight with exhaustion as red pins marked the German breakthrough in the Ardennes. When he asked his advisors, "How long can they hold?" the answer came back softly but brutally honest: "For days, maybe less." If Bastogne fell, the Germans would seize vital road junctions, fracture Allied supply lines, and deliver a crushing psychological blow to the Allied cause. Eisenhower felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, on his conscience, on history itself. Amid doubts, arguments, and logistical nightmares, his eyes settled on one name: George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army was facing the wrong direction, separated by snow, ice, and enemy forces, and turning it in time seemed impossible. Yet as Eisenhower stared at the map, he whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, that America was counting on this one man. 4 days remained. Somewhere in the frozen chaos of the European winter, the fate of Bastogne, and perhaps the war, hung on whether Patton could do what no other general dared to attempt. December 19, 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Verdun. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the rustle of maps and the low murmur of staff officers reading fresh reports from the front. Eisenhower stood at the head of the table, hands planted on the map of the Ardennes, eyes fixed on the small town circled in red: Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was still surrounded, still freezing, still running out of everything that kept men alive. Reports confirmed what he already feared: ammunition critically low, medical supplies nearly gone, wounded piling up in cellars and churches. Allied forces to the north were stalled. Units to the south were too far away. The weather remained brutal: snowstorms, frozen roads, low clouds grounding aircraft and choking movement. Eisenhower finally broke the silence. "How quickly can we mount a relief operation?" The generals exchanged glances. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, a quiet voice answered, heavy with calculation. "Sir, under these conditions, at least a week. Possibly more." Eisenhower straightened, jaw tightening. "We don't have a week," he said sharply. 4 days. 4 days is all they have." The room absorbed that truth like a blow. Pens stopped moving. A few officers stared down at the table, already seeing the consequences. To reach Bastogne, entire formations would have to be redirected through icy roads, fuel would need to be rerouted, supply lines stretched thin, and divisions turned in the middle of winter combat. It wasn't just difficult, it bordered on impossible. Eisenhower listened as commanders listed obstacles: snowdrifts blocking highways, frozen vehicles, exhausted men, enemy forces pressing from every direction. Each problem stacked higher than the last. Then from the far side of the table, George S. Patton leaned forward. His helmet sat beside him. His eyes were alert, almost restless. "I can do it," he said calmly. Heads turned. Patton continued, unshaken. He proposed pivoting 3 divisions of Third Army, an armored spearhead supported by infantry, driving nearly 100 miles north in 72 hours, through ice and enemy resistance, to smash into the German flank at Bastogne. A low murmur rippled across the room. Some officers whispered. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Eisenhower studied Patton carefully. "George," he asked, voice measured, "can you genuinely do this?" Patton didn't hesitate. "I've already prepared contingency plans," he replied. "If the order comes, my 4th Armored Division attacks north on December 22nd. The confidence in his voice stunned the room. He had planned this before the crisis fully unfolded, anticipating the move, gambling on his own foresight. Eisenhower felt both hope and dread rise at once. Failure would mean more than a lost battle. It would mean the destruction of the 101st Airborne, a catastrophic blow to Allied morale, and a stain on every man in that room. Eisenhower made that clear. If this fails, he said quietly, we lose Bastogne. We lose those men. And the consequences will follow us all. Patton met his gaze without flinching. It won't fail, he said. The Germans won't expect it. Speed is everything. Around them, staff officers scribbled timelines. December 19th, decision. December 20th and 21st, movement and pivot. December 22nd, attack. 48 to 72 hours to reach the town before the noose closed completely. Eisenhower looked down at the map again, feeling the weight of command press on his chest, the lives of 10,000 men balanced against one audacious gamble. He knew the risks. He also knew there was no better option. As the meeting broke, the room buzzed with uneasy energy, disbelief mixing with fragile hope. Outside, snow continued to fall across Europe. Inside, the decision had been made. The clock was ticking. Patton's impossible march was about to begin, and the fate of Bastogne would be decided by speed, steel, and nerve. December 20th, 1944. Before dawn, Patton's Third Army began to move. Orders rippled down the chain of command as entire divisions disengaged from the Saar region and pivoted 90 degrees north, a maneuver few armies in history had ever attempted, and none under such conditions. Snow buried the roads. Ice locked engines and weapons. Visibility vanished in blizzards that turned Europe into a white void. Tanks slid off narrow highways, crews shoving steel beasts back onto the road with numb hands. Artillery horses strained, breath steaming in the frozen air. Infantry marched with frostbitten faces, rifles wrapped in rags to keep the bolts from freezing. Patton pushed them relentlessly. 100 miles stood between them and Bastogne. Every hour mattered. By December 21st, German resistance stiffened. Enemy artillery rained down from wooded ridgelines, shells exploding in snow that swallowed sound and bodies alike. Ambushes flared along frozen villages, delaying columns already stretched to the breaking point.
Vehicle tallat.
Fuel ran low. Engineers worked through the night, clearing roads under fire. Still the army moved, slowly, painfully, mile by mile. Hourly reports reached Supreme Headquarters. Eisenhower studied them in silence, marking progress with a pencil that trembled slightly in his hand. 20 miles gained. Then stalled. Another push. Another delay. He checked the calendar again. 4 days. The margin was gone. Inside Bastogne, December 21st was a day of endurance. The 101st Airborne fought house to house, cellar to cellar. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men lay wrapped in coats and parachutes, their breath fogging the air as artillery shook the town. German tanks probed the perimeter, infantry shouting through the snow. When a German officer delivered a surrender demand, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read it, paused, and replied with a single word that echoed through the frozen town: nuts. The message spread like fire. It didn't change the situation, but it hardened resolve. December 22nd. Patton's 4th Armored Division attacked north, exactly as promised. Snowstorms battered the advance, winds cutting through steel and wool alike. German roadblocks burned under tank fire. American armor surged forward, then stalled again as counterattacks struck their flanks. Eisenhower received message after message. Progress, but slow. Casualties mounting. He paced his office, staring at the map, whispering to himself, if they fail, 10,000 paratroopers are lost, and the Ardennes may collapse. That night, he began drafting letters, words he prayed he would never have to send. December 23rd brought a brief miracle. The clouds broke. Allied aircraft roared back into the sky, dropping supplies into Bastogne and striking German positions along Patton's route. Hope flickered, but only briefly. The ground battle remained brutal. Roads turned to slush, then froze again. Men slept in ditches. Engines ran non-stop to keep from seizing. Eisenhower sent another message to Patton: maximum effort. The 101st cannot hold much longer. The reply came back fast. We're moving. We will break through. December 24th. Christmas Eve. The cold was merciless. German counterattacks slammed into the advancing columns, buying time inch by inch. American soldiers fought through villages lit by burning homes and flares. Every mile gained felt like a victory torn from fate itself. In Bastogne, the 101st clung to its shrinking perimeter, men sharing the last rounds, the last bandages, the last warmth. Midnight passed without relief. Another day lost. December 25th. Christmas Day. Eisenhower stood alone at the map, exhaustion etched into his face. Reports arrived by the hour now. 4th Armored was close, painfully close, but still not through. Staff officers whispered, some in awe, others in dread. He's actually doing it, one muttered. But is it fast enough? The night fell again. Snow drifted silently across the Ardennes. Clocks ticked. Calendars turned. December 26th loomed.
10,000 men waited.
The final hours approached. Would Patton reach Bastogne in time? The impossible march was nearing its climax. December 26th, 1944. Late afternoon. The snow still fell, but something had changed. After 6 days of relentless movement, Patton's Third Army was finally at the edge of Bastogne. Men were exhausted beyond words, faces hollow, uniforms stiff with ice, hands raw from gripping frozen steel, but they kept moving. Ahead of them lay German roadblocks, scattered armor, and infantry dug into the high ground. Artillery thundered one last time, shells ripping open the snow-covered fields. Tanks surged forward, engines roaring through the blizzard, tracks chewing through ice and mud. Infantry followed close behind, slipping, falling, rising again. No one slowed down now. This was the final push. German resistance cracked under the weight of the assault. Smoke rolled across the fields as American armor broke through, clearing the road mile by mile. Then, suddenly, the firing thinned. Shapes emerged from the white haze, paratroopers in filthy winter gear, helmets scarred, eyes sunken but unbroken. The men of the 101st Airborne. At approximately 4:50 p.m., the 1st American tank from the 4th Armored Division rolled into their lines. For a moment, there was silence. Then shouts. Cheers. Men laughing, some crying, some simply leaning against walls, too exhausted to move. One paratrooper reached out and slapped the side of the tank, grinning through a cracked, frostbitten face. About damn time, he said. The siege was over. Bastogne was no longer alone. Inside the battered town, word spread fast. Medics stepped out of freezing cellars. Wounded men lifted their heads. Officers shook hands with armored crewmen coated in mud and ice. The defenders hadn't broken. They had held. And now, relief had come. The link-up wasn't just tactical, it was emotional, almost overwhelming. Two battered forces, brought together by sheer will and speed, standing in the falling snow. Miles away at Supreme Headquarters, the phone rang. Eisenhower's aide crossed the room and handed it to him. Eisenhower took the receiver, already bracing himself. Then Patton's voice came through the line, gruff but steady. "Ike, we're through to Bastogne." For a long moment, Eisenhower didn't speak. His shoulders sagged as the weight of the past week drained away. His eyes closed briefly. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet, thick with relief. "Thank God." Around him, staff officers exchanged looks. Some smiled, some exhaled for the first time in days. A whisper moved through the room. He actually did it, against all odds. Patton, as always, brushed it aside. "Just doing my job, Ike," he said. "The men did the real work." Eisenhower listened, gripping the phone. He knew what had truly happened. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "No, George. You turned an army 90 degrees in a blizzard. You moved 3 divisions 100 miles under fire. You saved 10,000 lives." His voice softened. "That's why you're invaluable." When the call ended, Eisenhower remained still for a moment, staring at the map of the Ardennes. The red circle around Bastogne no longer felt like a grave marker. It felt like a victory. On the ground, Patton toured the lines briefly, offering curt nods and sharp words of praise. He didn't linger. He didn't celebrate. But his eyes betrayed pride, not in himself, but in the men who had made the impossible real. The 101st Airborne stood battered but unbowed, their stand now legendary. They had endured hunger, cold, and constant fire, and they had held long enough. Strategically, the breakthrough marked a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. German momentum stalled. The Allied line began to stabilize. What had seemed like a disaster days earlier was now slowly turning into a hard-earned victory. Privately, Eisenhower later reflected on the moment with rare emotion. In public, he praised coordination and courage. In his own thoughts, he knew the truth. One audacious decision, one impossible march, had changed everything. Snow continued to fall across Bastogne that evening, settling gently on wrecked vehicles and exhausted men. But the fear was gone. In its place stood relief, triumph, and the quiet understanding that history had just been made. Patton had not only saved Bastogne, he had preserved the Allied campaign in the Ardennes. And as Eisenhower looked toward the long road still ahead, he knew this moment would echo far beyond the frozen fields of Belgium. December 27, 1944. The guns around Bastogne were quieter now. Eisenhower sat alone in his quarters, the map of the Ardennes still spread across his desk, its creases worn from days of anxious study. For the first time in a week, he allowed himself to breathe. The weight that had pressed on his chest since the German breakthrough began to ease, replaced by something deeper and more complicated: relief, pride, and the lingering knowledge of how close disaster had come. In a private note that evening, he reflected on the decision that had defined those days, trusting George Patton with an impossible task. The responsibility was immense, he later wrote, for failure would have cost not only a town, but the lives of thousands of brave men. Eisenhower thought of Patton often during those quiet hours. Brilliant, audacious, unrelenting, a commander capable of extraordinary feats, and equally extraordinary trouble. Leading Patton had never been simple. He challenged authority, defied convention, and tested patience. Yet when the moment demanded speed, courage, and absolute confidence, Patton delivered. Eisenhower understood the paradox clearly: such men could not be controlled like others. They had to be managed, trusted, and at times, unleashed. In a letter sent shortly after the relief, Eisenhower praised Patton's execution while reminding him of the burden that came with such power. The words were measured, almost fatherly, acknowledging genius without encouraging recklessness. In private correspondence to his closest advisors and to leaders like General George C. Marshall, Eisenhower was more candid. Writing in early January 1945, he admitted how thin the margin had been. Bastogne, he noted, was more than a tactical objective, it was a test of leadership under pressure. The successful relief marked a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. German momentum had been broken. The Allied line had stabilized. What began as a desperate defensive stand had become a symbol of resilience and resolve. Publicly, Eisenhower spoke of teamwork and coordination. Privately, he knew that Patton's rapid pivot of 3 divisions, executed in brutal winter conditions, had been decisive. Yet Eisenhower's reflections always returned to the human cost. He thought of the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, holding frozen foxholes and shattered buildings with empty stomachs and dwindling ammunition. He thought of the tank crews who slept beside their vehicles in sub-zero temperatures, engines running through the night. Victory, he knew, was paid for in exhaustion, fear, and lives forever changed. Leadership at its core meant asking others to endure what you could not share yourself, and carrying that moral weight long after the guns fell silent. Years later, in his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote with rare clarity about those days. He did not glorify the danger, nor did he minimize the risk. Patton's relief of Bastogne, he reflected, vindicated my trust, demonstrated operational excellence, and reminded me why extraordinary talent must sometimes be managed, not constrained. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the truth behind the victory, that great outcomes often depend on difficult personalities, bold decisions, and the willingness to accept responsibility for both success and failure. The snow that once buried the Ardennes eventually melted. The war moved on. New battles followed. But Bastogne endured as a lesson etched into history. It showed what audacity could achieve when matched with preparation, what courage could endure when hope seemed gone, and what leadership demanded when the stakes were absolute. History remembers the breakthrough, the tanks, the maps, and the names. But beneath it all were the human decisions, the trust placed in one man, the resolve of thousands, and the courage to act when hesitation meant ruin. In the frozen winter of 1944, the impossible was made real. And in that moment, Eisenhower understood something timeless. True leadership is not found in safety or certainty, but in the courage to decide, and to stand by that decision when everything is on the line.